Salvador, Brazil, 1835. In the humid alleys of the city, whispers in Arabic rise like hidden fire. Hundreds of black men in white garments draw their daggers. Under the moonlight, João José Reis turns prayer into rebellion and makes an empire tremble. In the early 19th century, Bahia was both the heart and the wound of Brazil. It was the empire's richest port where sugar, tobacco, and human lives were traded side by side. Ships came from the coast of West Africa, their hulls filled with men and women captured from Yoruba kingdoms, from Hausa lands, from Mali's deserts. When the chains were removed, the marks remained around their wrists and in their souls. The city of Salvador was a strange world of opposites. Churches stood above markets where human beings had once been sold. On the cobblestone streets, Portuguese soldiers patrolled with rifles, watching over people who carried both the burden of memory and the seed of faith. The law was clear. No one was allowed to pray in the African way. But faith does not obey laws. In the backstreets of Salvador, far from the governor's eyes, men gathered at night in small rooms lit by oil lamps. They whispered ancient verses from the Quran, passed down through centuries of exile. They faced the direction of Mecca, even when they did not know exactly where it was. They washed their hands and faces in secret, using rainwater collected from rooftops. They were called the Males Muslims of African descent, proud and disciplined, who refused to forget who they were. Their faith was their last language of freedom. They spoke Arabic, wrote on parchment with charcoal ink, and saw themselves not as slaves, but as believers, walking a sacred path. Among them were scholars, tailors, carpenters, cooks, men who worked all day in silence and prayed all night in defiance. To them, Bahia was a battlefield without borders. Every act of prayer was resistance, every verse a blade sharper than steel. And above this world of chains and shadows, a young man named João José Reis watched, listened, and waited. He was born free, but the world around him was not. João José Reis grew up between two Brazils, one that wore the mask of empire and one that hid its pain in the alleys of Salvador. His father had been enslaved, his mother was born free. From her, he learned Portuguese. From his father, he learned silence. But it was from the Malay teachers that he learned something deeper, the power of words. He was fascinated by the Arabic script, the way it curved like the sea, each letter flowing into the next. He spent nights copying verses from the Quran, his candle burning low while others slept. The Malay imams taught him that knowledge was a weapon sharper than any sword. Yet João also saw the brutality of the empire. He saw soldiers drag men from mosques and whip them for kneeling on the wrong side of the street. He saw women forced to renounce their faith for a few coins of mercy. He heard priests preach obedience, while overseers preached punishment. In João's mind, two worlds collided: the faith of his ancestors and the violence of his homeland. He began to ask dangerous questions. If God created all men equal, who gave the empire the right to chain some of them? Every lash he witnessed, every insult he heard, every forbidden prayer whispered behind closed doors carved something inside him. Slowly, a thought began to form, quiet but unstoppable. Maybe freedom was not just a dream, maybe it was a duty. He walked through Salvador's streets, carrying two invisible weights, his faith and his fury. And one night, as the sound of drums echoed from the hills, João José Reis decided that silence was no longer holy. It was the holy month of Ramadan, 1835. Salvador glowed under the humid summer moon, and in the small clay houses of the Malay community, light flickered like secret stars. After the last evening prayer, João José Reis slipped through the narrow alleys toward the home of Bilal, a free craftsman known for his wisdom and his faith. Inside, the air smelled of ink and sweat. The windows were shuttered tight. Around a small wooden table sat the elders and imams of the Malay Brotherhood, each wearing a simple white tunic. They greeted one another in hushed Arabic, their eyes steady but tired. João sat among them, his heart beating with the rhythm of something ancient, not fear, but resolve. Bilal unrolled a piece of parchment. On it were words written in Arabic calligraphy, curved and powerful. Fi sabilillah, for the path of God. It was both a prayer and a declaration. The men spoke of what they had endured, the bans on prayer, the burning of their texts, the humiliation of being called heathens by those who whipped them in Christ's name. João listened in silence until Bilal turned to him. "What do you believe, son of Bahia?" João looked at the candlelight trembling across the parchment. "I believe that God hears us even when the empire forbids it," he said, "and if we must die to pray, then we will die praying." A murmur spread through the room, not of fear, but of faith. Each man dipped his finger in the inkpot and pressed a mark beside the words. It was their oath, to rise, to fight, not for vengeance, but for dignity. When the meeting ended, João stepped outside. The night was still. Above the rooftops, the moon hung pale and heavy, like an eye that had seen too much suffering. He whispered into the darkness, "Tomorrow, the Empire will hear our prayer." The 24th of January, 1835. Midnight. The city of Salvador slept under the humid weight of summer, unaware that history was about to awaken. From the labyrinth of alleyways, hundreds of black men moved silently, their white garments glowing faintly in the moonlight. They came from workshops, from docks, from sugar warehouses, fishermen, tailors, laborers bound by faith and fury. Some carried daggers curved like crescent moons. Others held makeshift spears carved from broom handles. At the front walked João José Reis, his face calm, his heart burning. "No chains tonight," he whispered, "only freedom." Then, a drumbeat deep and steady rolled through the streets. Another answered it from the hills. Within minutes, Salvador's night filled with the rhythm of revolt. The Malay warriors stormed the barracks first, taking the guards by surprise. Lanterns shattered, gunpowder hissed, and chaos spilled through the narrow streets. They broke open the city jail, freeing men who had been imprisoned for praying in Arabic. "Allahu Akbar" echoed through the darkness, mingling with the metallic clash of blades. João moved like a shadow between the skirmishes, guiding men through the alleys. Under the moon's pale light, their white robes became both armor and shroud. He raised his dagger toward the sky and shouted, "Tonight we are no longer servants. Tonight we are free men before God." For hours, the city trembled. Portuguese soldiers, startled and disoriented, struggled to regroup. Fires rose from the docks, painting the sky in orange smoke. Women leaned from windows whispering prayers. Children woke to the sound of gunfire and faith. When dawn approached, the uprising began to fade. The Malay forces were outnumbered, exhausted, surrounded. Yet even as the empire's cannons thundered and the streets ran with blood, João refused to retreat. In that fleeting moment between moonlight and morning, he saw what no conqueror could. Men standing shoulder to shoulder, unafraid, praying as they fought. And as the sun rose over Salvador, João José Reis realized that even if they lost the battle, they had already won the right to be remembered. By sunrise, the white robes that had glowed like purity under the moon were stained with crimson. The uprising had lasted only a few hours, but in those hours, the Portuguese Empire saw what it feared most: order bending under faith. As dawn broke, soldiers poured from the governor's palace like a flood of steel. The empire's cannons echoed through the cobblestone streets of Salvador. The smell of smoke and gunpowder choked the air. Houses were searched, doors smashed open. Anyone with dark skin and a white tunic was dragged into the street. João José Reis tried to regroup his men near the market square, but the noise of musket fire drowned his voice. He saw Bilal, the elder who had written their oath, struck down by a bullet as he tried to shield a younger man. João rushed to his side, but Bilal only smiled weakly, whispering, "We prayed, my son. They cannot unhear it." Soon the Malay fighters were scattered. Some fled to the hills, others were captured near the harbor. João stayed behind, guiding a group of children and elders away from the chaos. He knew the empire would hunt them all. Near a collapsed wall, he found a boy, no older than 12, trapped under the rubble. João lifted stones with his bare hands, ignoring the blood dripping from his fingers. The moment he freed the child, soldiers appeared, rifles raised, eyes hard with fear and hatred. "Drop the knife!" one shouted. João turned, breathing heavily. His dagger hung loosely in his hand. He looked at the boy, then at the soldiers. He let the blade fall. They seized him, struck him across the face, and bound his wrists. When they searched his tunic, they found a folded piece of parchment written in Arabic. "Freedom is the will of Allah." The officer who found it stared in silence. He couldn't read the words, but somehow, he understood their danger. That morning, as João was dragged through the streets toward the prison, the empire began its purge. Dozens of Malay men were executed in alleys or shot on sight. Others were tortured for information, their prayers mocked, and their faith called treason. But even in chains, the words João had written spread quietly among the prisoners. Freedom is the will of Allah. And no whip, no sword, no empire could erase that sentence. The courtroom in Salvador was packed. Portuguese officials, priests, soldiers, and curious townspeople crowded together, their whispers buzzing like flies over a wound. The empire wanted to show a warning to every black man who dared to dream. João José Reis stood in the center, his wrists bound, his tunic torn, his face bruised but composed. He looked neither proud nor afraid. Behind him, rows of captured Malay men waited for their names to be called, eyes hollow yet still burning. The judge, a pale man in gold-trimmed robes, slammed his gavel. "You are accused of treason against His Majesty, the King of Portugal," he declared. "You conspired to overthrow lawful authority. Do you deny these charges?" João's voice was quiet but firm. "I deny nothing, but I do not call it treason to ask for what God already gave us, freedom." Gasps filled the room. A soldier shouted for silence. The judge's lips tightened. "You raised an army," he said. "You shed the blood of Christians." João lifted his gaze, meeting the judge's eyes. "We shed no blood that had not already been spilled upon us. You call it rebellion, we call it prayer." For a moment, even the soldiers seemed unsure how to move. The words cut deeper than steel. They revealed the empire's greatest fear, not weapons, but conviction. Over the next days, witnesses were dragged in, confessions forced, sentences whispered before they were read aloud. But each time João was questioned, he answered the same way, calm, unbending. "I did not fight against the king," he said once. "I fought against chains." And somewhere in the back of the courtroom, an old Portuguese clerk dropped his quill, realizing what those words meant. The empire had built its power on silence. João José Reis had turned silence into speech. By the end of the week, the verdict was certain. The court sentenced him to death by hanging to make an example of him before the people of Bahia. When the judge read the sentence, João only bowed his head, murmuring a verse in Arabic. To those who knew the words, it was not despair, it was gratitude. For in his heart, he believed that death for truth was not an end, but a return. The day of the execution came heavy with heat. The square outside the prison filled before sunrise, soldiers with bayonets, merchants who wanted to see justice, priests clutching their crosses, and the silent poor who had no choice but to watch. Above them all stood the gallows, new and polished, like a monument to fear. João José Reis was led out in chains. His white tunic was freshly washed. He had asked for that not out of vanity, but reverence. "I will meet my lord clean," he told the guard who brought him water. The soldiers marched him through the crowd as the drums of the empire beat a slow rhythm. A priest approached, offering him last confession. João shook his head gently. "My confession has already been made every night I prayed." The priest hesitated, then stepped back. Even he could feel it, the calm that surrounded this man, the peace that frightened the powerful. As João climbed the wooden steps, the sun broke through the clouds, spilling light across the square. The hangman whispered, "Do you have any last words?" João looked out over the crowd. Some faces were hateful, some tearful, many simply tired. His voice was steady, neither loud nor pleading. "You may kill the man, but not the prayer. You may silence my mouth, but not the word that lives in all who remember." A hush fell. Even the soldiers lowered their eyes. The hangman pulled the rope. The beam creaked, the crowd gasped, and the city held its breath. When his body went still, no one cheered. The empire had expected victory, but what it got was silence, the kind that echoes louder than any cry. That night, women from the Malay community came to retrieve his body. The guards refused, so they waited until dark, bribed the jailer with a gold ring, and carried João José Reis away wrapped in white cloth. They buried him under a mango tree beyond the city wall, facing east toward the lands where their ancestors had prayed freely. And though the empire erased his name from every record, they could not erase the words that had passed from one generation to the next. He died as a free man, not as one who obeyed. The rebellion was crushed. The empire called it a victory. But beneath the ashes of Salvador, something began to move quiet, unseen, unstoppable. In the markets, whispers returned. People spoke of the men who had died in white robes, of the prayers shouted between gunshots, of João José Reis who faced the rope with calm eyes. Even those who had not joined the uprising began to see that faith was not the enemy of order, it was the heartbeat of freedom. The Portuguese governors tried to erase it all. They banned Arabic scripts again, forbade night gatherings, and punished anyone found speaking the old words. But repression has a strange way of teaching what it fears. Every punishment became a sermon, every silence, a lesson. Some years later, an old woman who had once attended João's lessons began teaching children to write in secret. She used charcoal and scrap wood, teaching them words that meant both faith and defiance. Sabura, patience; Huria, freedom. The children repeated them softly, as if each syllable might summon their teacher's ghost. Across Bahia, African-descended people began claiming small freedoms, buying their liberty, opening prayer rooms, demanding wages, sending their children to read and write. The empire, weakened by its own cruelty, began to bend. In 1850, the transatlantic slave trade to Brazil was officially banned, not because the rulers had found mercy, but because the world had changed, and the rebellion of the Malays had shown that the enslaved could think, organize, and believe. Freedom did not come overnight. It came like the tide, slow, persistent, impossible to stop. And among those who first felt its current were the people who whispered João's name in the dark, who believed that prayer was stronger than iron. Decades later, when Salvador's mosques reopened quietly under new laws, an old man walked in and placed a white cloth on the floor. He knelt, bowed his head, and said only one name: João. And in that moment, it was as if the city itself breathed again, a city that had learned, through blood and silence, that faith could outlive an empire. In the years that followed, Bahia tried to forget. The government issued decrees, burned confessions, and buried every document that bore the name of João José Reis. To the empire, memory itself was a threat, and forgetting became an act of power. But stories are seeds. You can burn a seed, but you cannot stop the wind from carrying its ashes. In Salvador's back streets, the old imams began to tell their children about the man who prayed on the gallows. They never said his name too loudly, not because of fear, but reverence. To them, he had become something greater than a man, a martyr of faith, o mártir da oração. At night, young boys would sit around the elders, listening to tales of courage whispered in Yoruba, Hausa, or soft Portuguese. They learned that João had fought not for revenge, but for the right to speak to God in his own tongue. They learned that a prayer could be a weapon, and that knowledge could outlast kings. Even some Portuguese-born priests began to speak differently. One of them, Father Manuel, who had watched the trial as a young cleric, confessed in his diary, "I saw a man condemned, but I felt as though we were the ones being judged." As time passed, Bahia changed. The slave ships stopped coming, the empire weakened, and Brazil began to dream of its own independence. But in the city's soul, João José Reis lived on in the rhythm of the drums, in the call of the muezzin at dawn, in every whispered verse that defied silence. When the first generation of free black citizens built new prayer halls, they left one small corner empty. A candle was always lit there for the man who had shown them that even death could kneel before dignity. There are revolts that change governments, and there are revolts that change souls. The uprising of the Malays did not end slavery. It did not win power, but it carved a wound so deep into the conscience of Brazil that the empire could never heal it. João José Reis never carried a musket. He carried faith, the most forbidden weapon of all. In his world, prayer was not escape. It was defiance. Every whispered verse of the Quran, every word spoken in Yoruba or Arabic, was a declaration that no empire could own the human spirit. History often forgets such men because they do not fit its simple lines of victory and defeat. Yet, in the quiet revolutions of the heart, João José Reis remains undefeated. His rebellion did not die in 1835. It continued in every freed person who learned to read, in every church that allowed African drums, in every mosque that dared to open its doors. If you walk through Salvador today, you can still hear echoes of that night. In the old quarters, where the walls remember more than they reveal, the sound of prayer still rises not as rebellion, but as remembrance. The people of Bahia have long understood what the empire never could, that faith, when chained, becomes fire. João José Reis turned that fire into light. and though his name was erased from the ledgers of the powerful, it was written in the wind, the drums, and the hearts of those who survived him. He taught the world something the empire could never learn, that a man who kneels to no king, but only to his God, can never truly be conquered. And so, whenever the night falls over Salvador and the call to prayer drifts softly through the air, it carries with it a whisper from the past, the same words found in João's pocket, the words that outlived every chain and every king. Freedom is the will of Allah.